This debate today is not about whether or not we should care about the environment. This debate today is not about who cares about the environment. This debate today, panel, is about whose actions are going to be more impactful to care about the environment and to achieve that common goal, which is to have a better future and a better environmental circumstances. So with that in mind, I will move on. So in my speech today, I will mainly be doing 4 things. First, define. Second, give our stance, split our case, and finally, give our percentage. So before all, what do we mean by those 9 planetary boundaries framework? This is a 9-dimensional scale. A 9-dimensional scale within which each dimension represents this specific Earth system that have these quantitative boundaries that we should not cross. Those dimensions could be something like in a freshwater unit, which is set as, for example, 4,000 cubic kilometers of water utilized for human consumption annually. And according to this framework, secondly, we have already crossed 4 out of 9 of the boundaries, which means that which is the reason why we are seeing all those things, which is the reason why we have the Australian bushfires, which is the reason why we have animal extinctions and the emergence of global pandemics such as the COVID-19. And according to this framework, which is an environmental framework, if we continue to do so, if we continue as we are to surpass those boundaries, we will just make it worse. But also, if we surpass more, which is the way that we are going into right now, we will unleash just additional predicted problems such as extreme weather and turning into even the Amazon into a savanna. So it is also important to say that this has been said by 28 international renowned scientists. That means that it is reliable, and if we follow it, we can do something. And that it is already being used by a lot of campaigns and policy works by NGOs. And this is exactly what we proposition support. And by doing so, we are recognizing the value of this framework, and we therefore expect it to, in our word, to be more reputed and used by policymakers and environmental organizations, which also will mean that individuals that actually cares for the environment would be following it because they are following those environmental organizations as a guide for certain environmental threshold. So to prove our case today, panel, we will prove to you first how businesses will just become more eco-friendly. Second, how people willing to act will be more likely to act. And finally, our second speaker will prove to you how governments will just become more effective with the climate issue. So first of all, by supporting the use of the 9 planetary boundaries framework, businesses are pushed to choose an impactful, friendly policy. It is a fact that boundaries, for marketing reasons, want to be seen as green friendly. But what is happening now? 2 main problems. First, we have the greenwashing problem. The greenwashing problem, which is hardly detectable and which can be set by 2 methods, whether it is by exaggerating the relevance of the area that we are impacting. That means that, for example, they would be just, doing some kind of action in some irrelevant issue and being like, we are green friendly, and we tell you, panel, that this is not going to be happening in our world anymore. Why so? 2 reasons. First, because the government will follow this specific framework that means that you can be sued if you are emphasizing and telling that you are impacting the environment when you are not within those 9 boundaries, and this is going to be just misinformation. And second, because the individuals are going to be aware of those 9 planetary boundaries, which means that in our world, we would know that the action is not relevant if it is not within one of those boundaries. But also, those greenwashing can be also done by exaggerating the importance of the changes that is made. For example, we would just be saving some of the liters of water and saying, yeah, we are eco-friendly, but you know what? This is not going to be happening in our world, because simply we have this common goal. It is set, it is quantitative. And us as humanity, we need to make this burden. It just means that it is much simpler to have this roughly estimation of how much exactly each of the businesses should be doing. So we are going to be aware, whether it's the government, whether it's the individuals, to have this reference of what each business should be doing, and would be able to see that what they are doing is just irrelevant. Another problem that we are facing in the status quo is basically that each business have this different understanding of what is important. They are making changes, but because it is so diverse, the importance of this change just fades in this diversity. But this is not gonna be happening in our world, because most businesses will have this reference for their work. So because, for example, the most pressing issue that, according to this framework that we have, have is the climate change. Most of the businesses would be doing something for the climate change, and even if no, they are going to be doing something for those within the 9 planetary boundaries and not in something outside of that. Why is it important for maintaining? Yeah.
As you can see, climate change, which is one of the 9 planetary boundaries, seems to be the most pressing and urgent right now. If what your problem is that greenwashing occurs and companies focus on irrelevant things, why not just focus on climate change? Why also include things like biosphere integrity?
Thank you. We think that what is important is that, and this 9 planetary boundaries just gives up how we can make a change only by having them all together. Because, okay, climate change is important. Imagine we only focus on climate change. We solve the problem of the climate change, but during that time, there are other problems that are not being tackled. We are only focusing on one thing, which is not going to be happening in our world, because we are telling you, panel, that those 9 planetary boundaries are complementary. Yes, a lot of businesses would be seen in it as an important thing, but not only. This is important because of 2 things. Because it incurs discouraging to discourage businesses from making those false and exaggerating claims, but also because it focuses more efforts and that are going to be just more effective, meaning we are just having more impact in short term, meaning that we are going to be able to source and this urgent problem. Moving on to our second sentence. By supporting these issues, we make actors who want to act upon the issue able to act. It is a fact that currently most people and organizations do care about the environment. It is a fact they know that there is a problem, but what is not happening is that it is not enough actions are being taken. And this is problematic because we have this kind of chess paralysis, and that's for 3 main reasons. First, because we are in front of this broad and limited list of environmental issues. Humanity is just lost and don't know exactly what they should be doing. There's just so many interpretations. Secondly, because people, whether they overestimate the issue and feel this overwhelmed freeze, or in the other hand, just underestimate the issue because it is not clear again what is the point exactly. So they are just going to be there. Okay, there's a problem, but just people are just exaggerating like every time. But this is not going to be happening in this world because, well, our framework is unique in addressing each of those reasons that makes the party paralyzed. First, because the 9 planetary boundaries framework provides the specific boundaries that can ensure Earth preservation. It is the only framework that encapsulates all the dimensions and that also responds to the point of information with a unique feature of specificity and quantification, enabling those individuals to focus on this clear objective. And secondly, because those people will go from this vague notion of, yeah, we should save the planet to, we should make sure that X thing doesn't reach Y degree, because therefore we won't have any more misconception of the gravity of the problem. Why does it matter? Because of 2 main reasons. Firstly, because not only does it directly affect the environmental issues, because now those people that believe in that change are being useful. For example, they would know exactly how important it is to consume less water, and secondly, because it also contributes in the healing of the mental health of the people. Because yes, our task paralysis is depressing and anxious, and we are overcoming that. And for all those reasons, I proudly propose this motion.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting first opposition to open opposition's case.
Panel, I implore you to take a look at reality. The problem in status quo is not that we lack knowledge about how we are hurting the planet. The problem is a lack of popular and political will to enact that change. The problem then is that the 9 planetary boundaries structurally worsens this apathy. 1, it is 9 different criteria that are given equal weight that is just too complicated and difficult for the general public to understand. We are debaters, most of us didn't even know what this was before this motion came out. 2, the criteria influence each other and policy has to account for multiple, if not all at once, which their first speaker concedes, which is too many moving parts for governments to account for, creating government apathy. And thirdly, it alienates the public by focusing too much on very specific things that the vast majority of people just don't care about, like the nitrogen cycle, forcing people away and worsening the perception of the environment as an unimportant issue only for the minds of scientists. What does supporting the framework mean they have to do on their side? One, that governments shift away from what they do in status quo, which is solely focusing on carbon dioxide and climate change, towards the 9 planetary boundaries. Two, that international agreements shift away from carbon caps and heating limits towards the 9 planetary boundaries. And three, the use of it in public advocacy, governments using it to justify their policies, the environmental movement appealing to it as a scientific authority, oppositions using it to criticize government policy. What then is our counterfactual? I want to note something very quickly, the difference between climate change and just the general environment, which is climate change is one of the 9 different boundaries. There are a bunch of other stuff that is harmful potentially, but has nothing to do with climate change, such as ocean acidification. Our status quo is then threefold. One, status quo, where we focus solely on carbon dioxide and global warming. We know it's one of the 9 boundaries. We support an exclusive focus on it alone, which is what people, governments, and international orgs already buy into. Two, we strongly advocate for research into carbon dioxide emissions and climate change prevention on a national and regional level, and we can still have the clear objectives that they want on their side. We don't have to be vague. Three, we can set global boundaries and targets, like the Paris Agreement's 2 degrees Celsius heating limit or the global net zero by 2050 target. Quick rebuttal before I move into argumentation. First, all the harms I talked about, this deforestation, desertification, wildfires, are exclusively caused by carbon dioxide emissions. These are not part of any of the other 9 boundaries because the other boundaries have other purpose. Second, on businesses, I want to note, we'll flip this in our second argument, but this argument is just not exclusive to the 9 planetary boundaries. This argument is a benefit of any competent government framework. We can still sue for misinformation on our side of the house. We can still more strictly enforce environmental policy on our side of the house. But I'm going to flip it. Their problem is that businesses have different understandings of the environment. That is much worse in a world where you have to focus on 9 different things than just one panel. They hurt themselves. In response to our POI, I think yes, maybe focusing on all of them would be ideal, but they haven't proven to you why it is likely. And the fact that it is unlikely is why they are going to have a worse climate response. But lastly, their second argument's impact is very minimal. All it does is get people who already care about the environment to act. What we need is, more importantly, people who currently do not care about the environment to care about the environment. Just because people know about climate change doesn't mean they care. Our argument will prove we get that better. Before my arguments,
I want just to ask that do you think that all those scientists were wrong with saying that we can only make sure that the environmental problem is solved if we have all those 9 planetary boundaries cared about in the same time and not only climate change?
No, they're not wrong, but there's a difference between environmental problems and climate change in specific, which is what we think we should care about most. First argument then as to why the 9TB decreases the likelihood of policies being passed at all. First level of this argument, you're going to have to focus on all 9 boundaries at once in policy making, which is also what I note their first speaker pushes. 2 reasons why this is bad. One, you can't advocate for boundaries at different points in time because you will be seen as flip-flopping by your electorate, so we'll have to push them all at once. 2, left-wing parties and the scientists they want to talk about criticize governments on the basis, like they just criticized me, that you cannot just focus on one thing and have to focus on all of it. This means it's just harder to pass policy because you need to account for more things at the same time. Second level of this argument, it reduces buy-in to the idea of environmentalism generally. 3 reasons. 1, governments can trade it off more easily. Opposition parties can disguise their anti-environmentalism as nitty-gritty criticism based on the 9 boundaries because it is much easier to do so than just say, yeah, we are supported by big oil. This creates gridlock in government, which means that governments have an incentive to trade off all environmental policy on their side of the house. But second, the process of creating policy becomes longer. You have to do more research, you have to do more testing, all of which is more expensive panel, which is why governments want to avoid it. But 3, you create public apathy. People feel overwhelmed by now having 9 different issues they have to care about at the same time, and the fact, like they said, that we've already reached 5 of the 9 means that when people don't see the harms occurring right now, they disassociate from the environmental movement because they just think it's an alarmist movement that doesn't really care about anything important. This means that you reduce buy-in to environmentalism generally. What is the counterfactual on our side of the house? carbon dioxide in particular and focusing on it avoids these issues. One, because opposition parties have focused on the nitty-gritty as an excuse because it is only one criteria that is already well known by people. So they have to pick a side or they have to be transparent about being in the oil lobby's pocket, all of which means we get more accountability. Two, it is easier to visualize and portray the harms of carbon dioxide. We see emissions right now. We see wildfires right now. We saw wildfires and smog in New York literally this June panel. We already have buy-in for carbon dioxide. The importance of this argument is simple. We get more policy. I will trade off that it will not be perfect, but their side creates a gridlock that means you get no environmental policy at all, hurting even their own end goal. Second argument as to why even if proposition somehow gets equal buy-in, which they have yet to prove, why they get worse outcomes for the environment. First level of this argument, why focusing all resources on CO2 is the most important thing we should do. One, carbon dioxide is the most direct contributor to global warming. It is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere at 75%, and it stays in the atmosphere for centuries, unlike any other greenhouse gas. Two, carbon dioxide affects every other boundary more than those other boundaries affect carbon dioxide because of the scientific reason known as radiative forcing. What does this mean? Acid rain by carbon dioxide hurts arable land. 40% of carbon dioxide is what creates ocean acidification. So solving carbon dioxide is a prerequisite to solving any of the other boundaries they want to care about. But thirdly, it has the most damaging implications to our society right now. 61,000 people died in Europe last year alone due to heat waves. Island nations like my very home of Sri Lanka and the Maldives are sinking. Pulling any resources away from CO2 at all damns people in the status quo. But second level of this argument, why you actually increase global warming on their side of the house. First, you prevent reductions in CO2 because there are many interventions that reduce CO2 but hurt the other boundaries by taking up things like land, water and nitrogen, biofuel expansion, green technology, carbon offsetting, all of which the environmental movement has to oppose on their side of the house because it has to abide by the 9 planetary boundaries, meaning that CO2 emissions increase. Two, it is harder to do technology sharing because different countries will likely prioritize different boundaries within the 9 boundaries, and thereby you are unlikely to be able to get the green technology response to effectively curtail climate change. But lastly, lobbying from companies. I agree that companies want to look PR friendly, but you know when it's easier to greenwash? When you have 9 different buzzwords that you can throw around at any point in time that people don't really know the meaning of, that you can use to obscure the fact that you continue to pollute and continue to screw over the environment. Importance of this argument is simple. The increased climate change in the environment becomes worse. This is just too complicated. Stick with the simple stuff that gets stuff done.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting second proposition to further proposition's case.
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished judges, and honorable opponents, as the second speaker for the proposition, I stand before you today to re-emphasize the importance of supporting views of the 9 planetary boundaries framework. We firmly believe that by embracing this framework, we can overcome the overwhelming freeze that paralyzes individuals and governments together, and we can pave the way for effective environmental action. Today, I'm going to be doing 4 things. Firstly, I'm going to go over the characterization the first speaker told you briefly. Secondly, I'm going to rebut a couple of things that Team Op said today. Thirdly, I'll present my arguments concentrating on the governmental implications as the first speaker covered the other aspects. My argument will be about the informed decision making for effective environmental policies. And lastly, I'm going to be doing some necessary weighing to prove that our side of the world is the superior side. Okay, so the first speaker eloquently presented the overwhelming challenges that we face today as a society, with policymakers and individuals alike struggling to prioritize and take action due to the broad and the unlimited list of environmental issues. They highlighted the 2 main psychological barriers that hinder this progress. Firstly, the feeling, I will do that later, the feeling of helplessness and the overwhelming freeze, and the underestimation of the issues from others. And it is precisely these barriers that the 9 planetary boundary framework seeks to address for a better world. For instance, by providing specific boundaries and quantifiable targets, this framework offers a unique feature of clarity and objectivity that Team Op completely disregards. It shifts the conversation from vague notions to concrete objectives, enabling individuals and policymakers to focus on clear and measurable goals. actually advocate for actions to ensure that a specific factor, such as carbon emissions, for example, does not exceed a certain degree. This specifically dispels misconceptions and ensures a common understanding of the gravity of the problem that we face. I will now be moving on to rebuttal quickly. So the speaker made several faults in his speech, several faults, saying that this framework is filled with complex problems people simply do not care about. It's totally irrelevant. I'll be taking that later. Well, we are here to tell you that if you think that saving the environment, which we all know our environment is dying, is not a problem that is valid enough, we don't know what to tell you. Plus, they also said that there are too many boundaries and there are too many problems that this framework encompasses, and that people simply cannot keep track of them. Well, let me tell you that our environment is facing a lot of problems. What would you rather? If everyone concentrates on one problem and we can't even ensure that that problem will get fixed, or if we help all these pressing problems so that we can ensure a better future? And I'll actually be talking about the impact that this will have later on in my speech. Also, we would just like to say, truth is that while implementing these global boundaries can be complex, like I will be taking that after my rebuttal, can be complex, like you mentioned, the framework provides a universal reference point for countries to be able to assess their environmental impact. It literally encourages dialogue and cooperation among different nations to find solutions find solutions, and they also have boundaries that they cannot cross, so they know what to do and what not to do. And this objectivity simply helps tremendously. Once again, truth is our environment is dying. Truth is having a plan is better than having no plan at all, because Team Up has completely failed to give us even an average plan at all, like even a substitute. Truth is people are more willingly to act when they see that their world is dying. I'll not be taking this.
Why does our side need to not have a plan and be vague? Why can't we get strong, measurable emissions like in status quo, like we portrayed in our model?
Because you're saying that we should just continue like we are continuing, but truth is nothing is getting fixed. Why? But with this non-planetary boundary, governments know explicitly what to do. They know what to cross, what not to cross. They know how it's going to work, how not it's going to work. But with having a clear framework like this, we can ensure that our world will not die and that our environment will be saved. I'll now be moving on to my first argument. We strongly contend that this framework is a game changer in the realm of environmental policies, specifically addressing the long-standing issue of government's lack of clear goals and limited actions. We strongly contend that this framework enables government to make significant progress in addressing global environmental challenges by providing clearer goals and promoting holistic thinking. Now, allow me to shed light on how this framework has revolutionized the landscape, has fostered collaboration, clear goal setting, and effective decision-making among governments. Now, in the pre-framework era, governments often found themselves embroiled in debates and disagreements regarding environmental goals. Now, with an overwhelming multitude of challenges to tackle, the lack of coherent framework simply made it even more difficult for governments to agree on a unified course of action answering clear POI. The results? Well, inaction and stagnation. The absence of clear goals and a structured framework hinders progress seriously, leaving the environment at the mercy of inconsistent or simply no efforts at all. Now, however, the non-planetary boundaries framework has emerged as a beacon of hope, bringing governments together under a common purpose. By providing clearer and measurable goals, this framework has transformed the ways in which governments approach environmental policies. The boundaries defined within the framework act as a guiding force, using the dimensions within governments must operate and highlighting the limits in which they cannot, that should not be crossed. The structured nature of this framework is its defining strength. It offers governments a comprehensive roadmap, leaving no room for ambiguity or even indecision. I will not be taking that. With clearly defined boundaries, governments can now set their priorities with confidence and furthermore allocate resources accordingly. The framework acts as a compass, and we cannot stress this enough. It provides their direction to governments and ensures that their efforts are channeled towards the most pressing, challenging, and impactful environmental challenges that we are facing. A significant breakthrough facilitated by this framework is the enhanced communication and collaboration between governments. By establishing a shared language and understanding, the framework encourages cooperation among nations, and we cannot stress this enough. Now, let's talk about impacts, about how the adaptation of the non-planetary boundary framework holds immense promise for both the present and for future generations, something Team Opposition has completely disregarded once again in today's debate. In the long term, this framework safeguards the environment by equipping governments with the knowledge and tools to address the pressing challenges. So by embracing this framework, we ensure that our planet remains habitable and prosperous for generations to come. Panel, team opposition, we have clearly won today's debate for a multitude of reasons. Unlike team op, we have given different arguments that include all stakeholders and everyone involved. We mentioned the people and how the actors will feel the incentive to act. 2, we mentioned the businesses and how they will feel obligated to act eco-friendly. 3, we mentioned governments and their role in all of this. And this is of the utmost importance because unlike Team Op, we have not left anyone out. All major players have been regarded and our environment has been regarded. Unlike Team Op, we are actually worried about our world and the actions of our world and the most pressing issues of our world. Unlike Team Op, we are actually saying that on our side of the world, we are actually recognizing that on our side of the world, our Earth is crumbling and that we need specific frameworks to be able to go over this challenge so that in the long term, generations to come can live in a habitable or even just a decent Earth. Unlike Team Op, we are finding solutions and have regard to everything, leaving our case unbreakable no matter how many rebuttals they present. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting second opposition for the opposition's case.
Hi, can you hear me if I speak like this? Yeah. In at least the next speech, proposition needs to start debating the case in front of them. Our counterfactual was not a vague, abstract, unambiguous, unshaped approach to environmental degradation, but rather what we supported was an exclusive focus on one of the 9 planetary boundaries. If you are confused about why they continue to insist that their harms or the harms that they point out to the status quo are unique to their side, then you are not alone. We think that if it is true that there is uncertainty, if it is true that there is choice overload, if it is true that there is a massive problem with the quantification of boundaries and a lack of support, surely focusing on one of the 9 different things that they want to support means that all of these things, by virtue of the fact that quantitatively it is just one less, get far, far better on our side of the house. Despite the clarifications that we made in our one and the extensive setup that we did, they continue to insist that these harms will prevail without analyzing why comparatively in a world where there is an exclusive focus on carbon emissions and the impact that they have on global warming, why we cannot achieve those benefits to a greater extent. Following from this, however, I want to try to be as charitable as possible in this speech. Let's assume their best case, which is that there is some trade-off that we have to make with ignoring the other 8 planetary boundaries. What I will prove in this speech is why even an exclusive focus on carbon, accounting for the harms of this trade-off, is justified. This leads me to 2 areas of response. First, on increasing buy-in for the environmental movement. Secondly, on better environmental policies. First, on increasing buy-in. And I just want to make clarification here about how far fiat extends in this debate. Yes, they have the fiat to support the 9 planetary boundaries, but they do not have the fiat to insist that they have a similar amount of buy-in on either side of the house. The cheeky characterization that comes in their first speech is the idea that there is already support for the environmental movement. Perhaps this is true in some niche parts of the developed world, but broadly, we think that many people are still hesitant to act on climate change. They're still hesitant to put into effect actionable policies that limit and have a significant opportunity cost in their daily lives, giving up jobs in the fossil fuel industry, giving up on your most profitable industries as a country. So clearly buying is not a question this create and is an important clash.
Yeah.
They need to prove why reverting to this boundary, given that this is not the status quo. In many international agreements we focus on carbon. Montreal, Paris, all of these are carbon caps. In many domestic governments we engage in things like carbon permitting, or we measure the carbon footprint of companies and individuals. So clearly carbon is the status quo. They need to prove not only why they can retain the existing level of buy-in to the status quo, but why they get exponentially more buy-in with the 9 country boundaries framework. This leads me to the first area of response, on which side gets more buy-in from people. Their claim is that uncertainty and the sheer scale of the environmental problem creates choice paralysis. I have 2 responses to this. Firstly, intuitively we solve for this. We narrow it down to the 9 boundaries that are interacting with each other in complex ways that even environmental scientists are trying to figure out for themselves, into a far more actionable singular goal, which is an exclusive focus on carbon. Now perhaps this means in the short term that we need to trade off some of the other boundaries. For example, biogeosphere integrity might be relatively neglected on our side of the house. But if the specific problem is that no action on climate change happens in a world of uncertainty and choice overload, surely trading off some of the other boundaries or temporarily neglecting them in favor of some action on climate change brings us even in our worst case. The problem with their side is that they increase the burden on people who are already environmentalists. Environmental advocates that have spent decades championing carbon monitoring and carbon permits, who advocated aggressively for the adoption of carbon goals in international agreements, now feel dejected by the fact that governments are rapidly transitioning towards a different environmental framework, one that significantly deprioritizes the one thing that they have been solely advocating for. They see this as a shift away from an actionable goal towards something that is more vague and ambiguous, precisely the problem that they had on their side of the house. So clearly we get more buy-in from people. I'll analyze some exclusive reasons at the end of this clash that Ram responded to as well, as to why we get more buy-in from people. But on to the second stakeholder. Which side has more buy-in from governments? The first thing that they say in their first speech is that the quantification of boundaries is easier on their side of the house. The first thing that I want to point out, again intuitively, is that the quantification of a single boundary, given that a carbon cap is still a boundary and a global boundary that we cannot exceed, for example, the 2 degrees Celsius limit set up in the Paris Convention. So clearly we have a better singular boundary on our side of the house, and at best we can claim all of their benefits on quantification. But the second response that I want to make is that we actually have a more accurate boundary on our side of the house for a number of reasons. Firstly, carbon is something that we've been measuring for a very long time. Ever since industrial production started, carbon, because for environmental reasons it's easily measurable, it often has a visible impact on the environment, is something that we have historic data about. So it is something that we can create a far more reasonable boundary for, something that we are far less likely to revise the boundary for. What they forgot to tell you is that in 2011, 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries were actually revised, creating massive uncertainty as to whether in the future those same boundaries might be revised again. You know what hasn't been revised? Since the past 2 decades, our limits on carbon and our understanding of how many carbon emissions the planet can take has been relatively fixed. Before I move on, make the point.
Okay, in all of this, criticizing is easy. Everybody can do it. But what is your substantive? What is the substitution to this to helping our environment?
So our substitute is in fact the status quo, with exclusive focus on carbon and its effects on global warming. What you're supporting is a transition away from status quo towards a planetary boundary framework. The second reason why we also have a more accurate cap is that carbon emissions are measured for reasons besides environmental causes. For example, we can use the production of companies that use fossil fuel as a proxy to measure carbon emissions. Things like biogeosphere changes are incredibly difficult to measure and exhaust raw resources of the environmental movement in merely monitoring the extent to which we are contributing to those boundaries in the first place. On our side of the house, measuring these is far easier as well. The third response that I want to make, and this response also to the claim that they make in their second speech that there is a common law, common goal, although this is only really rhetoric. The problem with the 9 country boundaries framework, unlike carbon, given that the vast majority of countries, even those that are poor and developing, inevitably emit carbon emissions because they use fossil fuel and because they are producing businesses, is that the other 8 boundaries are extremely subjective geographically. Ocean acidification only applies to countries that have large coastlines. Biogeosphere integrity only applies to countries that have a significant wildlife population and are therefore affected by them. If their problem is that they need a common goal, something that all countries can unanimously agree is equally important, a focus on carbon justice. The reason why carbon is a far better metric is because you can identify the degree of contribution as well. Biogeosphere integrity is something that countries contribute to in a variety of ways, but it's particularly developing countries that are seen as contributing the most in harming it, because they inevitably have to resort to things like allowing poaching in their countries as a form of economic revenue, which means buying from developing countries is far, far lower. On our side, we can point to the fact that the most developed economies, those that have the greatest capacity to engage in environmental actions, are also those that emit the most carbon. So for these reasons, we think we need this line to environmental movement. Second area of response on better environmental policy. Unfortunately, they don't respond to the vast majority of Ashwin's speech about how we have better technology sharing and better coordination. But they do say one thing on accountability. They say that businesses have incentives to be environmentally friendly and that you prevent greenwashing. No, this is not true. First, it is easier to skirt accountability on their side of the house on the part of businesses because you can point to the high bar set by the 9 country boundaries framework. Businesses can continue to engage in environmental surveys to make sure that any environmental policy or CSR project that they pass is in line with all 9 country boundaries in order to skirt the responsibility to actually do something. Additionally, I have to point out existing carbon capture projects, which many carbon emitting producers have already been pushed to try to create, are less likely on their side of the house. You know why? Because carbon capture has massive effects on biogeosphere integrity and the nitrogen cycle, something that these companies can do to shut down existing CSR projects that aren't profitable for them. On our side of the house, we have better technology sharing, a green tech lobby that is growing in strength, that is able to produce cheaper green technology at a greater and more efficient scale. We have existing carbon markets, like the European carbon market, that allow companies to remain profitable by buying carbon permits, while still reducing net emissions. None of this exists in their world. For all these reasons, opposed.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting third proposition to close out proposition's constructive case.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2. Every year, millions go to the Ganges River, wishing to swim for religious benefits, for cleaning and cleansing themselves of sins. Instead, they're exposed to a river that is filled to the brim with feces, with dead bodies, and with other such chemical runoff. On the other side of India, people cannot grow crops because their soil has been deprived of every single nutrient there is. But obviously, carbon dioxide is all that is important, and that is what their team said. With that in mind, I would like to show you why our opposition's case is critically wrong and provides a worse world and a disastrous outcome for the climate as it stands. I will do that as a third speaker through a few things. First, I will outline some of the tactical flaws that they have made in their speech, and then continue with some rebuttal of the points they've made, and then end with rebuilding my case, which frankly does not need much rebuilding. So first, we think that they've made a very severe tactical flaw in not implementing any sort of policy, instead relying on the status quo. We believe that this may be out of laziness or maybe the unwillingness to admit that the current status quo is not going in the right direction when it comes to tackling climate change. And then their second speaker continued with giving them a very light burden of proof. We believe that in fact they need to prove much more than that. They need to prove that there are other models that exist to the current model that can provide better outcomes for the environment, and that are actually better than the proposed 9 planetary boundaries model. Considering they haven't done that, we believe we have won that side of the debates. And they've also ignored how bad the issues around climate change have gotten, especially since, as their second speaker clearly said, they are in the status quo. Might I remind you, the status quo is what I presented in my introduction, and is that a world you want to live in? I do not believe so. With all of that in mind, I would like to rebuttal some of their claims. Now, everyone, the first thing they think when they see the 9 planetary boundaries framework is that it's a little too complex. You can't really do anything with it. We believe that this is at worst symmetrical, and at best doesn't happen. First, even in your world, where people are using carbon, actually when businesses are trying to implement carbon reducing strategies, they aren't just saying, yes, we should reduce carbon. They're putting through expensive research. They have extensive policies, and this is already too complicated for the average citizen. And might I remind you that models, even complicated, are easily scalable. So yeah, while the 9 planetary boundaries framework, as it is in its raw state, might sound very technical and complicated, if you frame it as, okay, you should you should reduce nitrogen usage because this is bad for agriculture. Then suddenly everyone understands. Then suddenly the millions involved in farming within the world understand. So for that reason, you haven't won that side of the debate. Then secondly, they say that you should focus exclusively on CO2. And then the first speaker made a very crucial blunder, which is saying that CO2 composes what? 75% of the air atmosphere, when actually it is 400 parts per million. I don't need to tell you how to do the math, but that shows a clear lack of scientific expertise that is needed to discuss this motion in detail. And then this, in the status quo, people already use CO2 as a buzzword, yet we still see disastrous effects from climate change every day. Australian wildfires that my first speaker mentioned, and other such consequences that their speaker mentioned. So with that in mind, how do you propose to me that we stick with CO2 when sticking with CO2 has made our environment so vulnerable? I will take that later. They say that other models are better for policy making. And I'd say that while having one boundary like CO2 is buzzword worthy, is something that you can use in an election very easily to get votes, it also makes it easier to promote civil disobedience. So, okay, as a president, you promote CO2 reduction, and then 5 years later in your term, nothing happens in the climate, and people are suddenly disillusioned. So what's this CO2 we're talking about? Why does that happen? Because I remind you, climate systems are interconnected. You don't have just CO2, you have nitrogen usage, which affects oil quality. You have other water factors, which also affect the everyday life. So we don't really see the need to promote a system that ends up producing instability and might even lead to the rise of extremism and anti-environmentalism. We're speaking of ordinary people in the world. So if they see that CO2 reduction might not be producing results, they might think, oh, why would I support the 9 boundaries framework? It's also not going to do anything. So in the end, focusing exclusively on CO2 reduction actually could lead to an extreme rise in anti-environmental sentiment. And then they say that it's easier to focus on 1, not on 9. We have 2 responses. This ignores, again, the current status quo, and then once again, I would like to explain that 1 is not enough. Every single factor in the climate is interconnected, and you need to tackle them together in order to achieve any sort of meaningful climate change. As we came here to the competition, we thought there would be clear skies, but instead, many were exposed to a typhoon. And in the future, these will get worse because of policies that only take into account the CO2 and not the other scientific factors that actually have an enormous impact on the everyday lives of people and on the climate. Now I would like to move on to some rebutting.
Yes. If what you say is true, and people in India are suffering from a lack of access to clean water resources, the Indian government would likely address that on either side, even if they focus exclusively on carbon, merely because it's a health issue, the same way that the Australian government would focus on wildfires. Insofar as having a common goal is necessary, is it a focus on carbon better?
We don't think a focus on carbon is better because of all the reasons we stipulated earlier. Now, then again, they say that all harm, so they say about our case that all harms are caused by CO2. So they think it's rather narrow, it's too much to focus on 9 boundaries. We don't believe this is true. You have other environmental disasters that are not the product of CO2 and maybe more relevant to everyday people. Say we stop producing CO2 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. People are still getting sick, getting cancer for chemical runoffs in massively populated countries. Say India, say your own country of Sri Lanka. And we don't understand why you push this idea so much. They also say that you have worse finances on the side because there's very expensive research that you have to lead when you have 9 boundaries. While this could be true, we believe that finances are a rather irrelevant metric within this debate. Because might I add, this is the environment. Obviously, in the short term, reducing your production of petroleum, reducing your production of gas, reducing your water usage, reducing your soil exertion will lead to worse business outcomes. But at the long term, it leads to the longevity of the earth, the people inhabiting it, and actually governments and businesses themselves. So they also say that they also say that they also give the example of the European carbon market. What they haven't said is that the European carbon market has made the price of a share of carbon so cheap that even Total could buy and could say they are actually acting on the climate when they're actually not doing anything. It is no strain on their finances and does not end up producing any actionable climate change. To end, they've made a very big assumption on their side of the world, which is that, okay, you focus exclusively on carbon and suddenly everything gets solved. We want to say that that's simply not true. We want to remind you that the funding for green technology, for green policy, is very little. And whether you focus on 1 or 9, the effects on the short term is rather little. So this is at worst symmetrical to both sides of the world. With all of that in mind, let's save the environment, and I am very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting third opposition speaker to close out opposition's constructive case.
I want to make 3 important observations at the top of this speech. The first is, the opposition in this debate believes that we won't have a boundary on our side of the house, because that is the direct context that comes from the first proposition speaker themselves, that they say you need a boundary. I just want to point out that boundaries would exist on either side of the house, and this is not a contention in this debate. The real contention is whether we get buy into these boundaries, and that is what we proved from our first speech. The second I want to point out is the contradicting characterization in their first argument. On the one hand, they say, let's give businesses and governments several aspects to focus on. On the other hand, the real problem is that they scapegoat responsibility. If they have an incentive to scapegoat responsibility, giving them 9 boundaries is the excuse to scapegoat responsibility, so they can't have both of these benefits simultaneously. They need to pick and choose what they want to defend. But the third thing I want to observe at the top is what is status quo. Because what they tell you is that status quo has failed. Sure, this might be true. But the difference on our side of the house is that we can regulate against this and use the same political and economic fear that they use to build awareness around the 9 planetary boundaries, and we can use this fear to regulate the current system, to change the carbon market if it's not working in the most effective way. 2 important clashes then in this speech. First on buying, second on who creates better policies. First on buying, I want to point out 3 important stakeholders as they correctly analyze. First is businesses. One observation is that if carbon is the most important and they concede that they would came towards carbon in some way, the problem is businesses benefit from carbon pollutions the most. The importance of this is that if businesses benefit from carbon pollutions the most, that is the reason as to why they would focus on the irrelevant other 8 boundaries that they talk about. This is exactly why carbon won't be focused on their side of the house, and their argument on focusing on prioritizing on irrelevant issues is amplified on their side. But the second thing I want to point out is that if businesses would prioritize irrelevant issues now, and boundaries give them a sense of direction, which is their argument, this is the reason as to why boundaries should exist, and I've already proven why this could exist on either side of the house. The second claim that they make then is that businesses are likely to buy implicitly in their first argument because they can pick and choose which boundaries that they want to focus on. The first observation I want to make regarding this is that it cuts into their argument that all 9 boundaries are equally important. If all 9 boundaries are equally important, why do businesses have to pick and choose boundaries? What they should do is pressurize businesses to focus on all 9 boundaries, and this is exactly the reason why buying decreases on their side of the house. Because businesses are forced to care about all 9 boundaries, and it's a significant amount of pressure, which means that it allows businesses to scapegoat on that responsibility. The second response I want to make here is that even if businesses care about these boundaries due to some reason that they talk about, I want to point out that businesses have the capacity to do the bare minimum
bare minimum on their side. This is because they can just point out, I have 9 boundaries to care about, I would just care about each of them in the most minute form. The problem is, the net harm from this is likely to be significant. At least on our side, when it's carbon, it's one boundary. You can set a high bar for them, they need to abide by this, your ability to hold them accountable is greater, so it is not enough for businesses to do the bare minimum. The reason why this is important is because the net benefit on the environment that we get on our side is significantly higher, and they are forced to act. The third thing I want to point out, and third argumentation that they present, is that the ability to scrutinize is easier because of carbon. I want to make 3 responses and 3 reasons as to why the ability to scrutinize is harder when it's 9 category boundaries. The first is the media attention in terms of the dispersion of information is likely to be untargeted. We are going to talk about all 9 boundaries, which means that the ability to bring information on one boundary and the extent of the information that you bring on that side is likely to be the bare minimum. This means that the ability to scrutinize is low because different media sources are telling you that different boundaries are equally important. The second reason as to why the ability to scrutinize is harder is because people can easily be fooled with the lack of information. Governments and institutions can just not give information about 2 people to have the ability to scrutinize because there are 9 boundaries and therefore it is easier to do that. Comparatively on our side, because it is one boundary, people can demand for information. Surely it's just one boundary, surely it's carbon, then you need to make us understand why carbon is more important. If it's 9 boundaries, the incentive for people to demand for information also significantly lowers because it's 9 different boundaries. Who has the time to invest into studying about 9 different boundaries? But even if they do, they only know the bare minimum. The implication of this means is that buy-in is significantly lower on that side because the information that individual people have is significantly lower, which also cuts their argument on the sense of urgency that they want to talk about. The third reason as to why the ability to scrutinize significantly is vindicated on their side is because there's going to be fragmentation among the people itself. Some people might believe that carbon is important. Some people might believe that ocean acidification is important. This means that the ability to scrutinize and hedge against the business community is also significantly harder. Comparatively on our side, 1, the ability to disperse information is easier by movements and governments because it's one boundary and you can target that information, which means that the ability to scrutinize is greater. But second, people are more willing to engage in discourse. The barrier to entry in discourse is significantly low on our side. You just need to know what carbon is and therefore it's easier to engage in that information. But the problem is when it's 9 boundaries and people are just coming after you that different boundaries are equally important, this is when the barrier to entry into discourse itself significantly increases. The implication of all this means that businesses are likely to be exploitative and are unlikely to pass policies regarding that on their side. Secondly then, in terms of buying from people, the implication from the characterization that comes from Prop 1 is that 4 out of 9 boundaries have been breached, which means obviously there's going to be urgency. The first thing I want to point out is that if their argumentation is feeling helpless and hopeless, if 4 out of 9 has breached, this is the reason why they would feel helpless and hopeless. But the second thing I want to point out is that they say the effects can be seen on either side of the house, but this is not true. Maybe 4 out of the 9 boundaries have been breached and you can see the effects of those 4. But the problem is the rest of the 5 haven't been breached and therefore the effects of them cannot be seen visualizable for the people itself. Even if the effects can be seen, the problem is not everyone sees it. Maybe Sri Lankans face the problem of ocean acidification and they see the impact of it. But probably people in America don't see the impacts of it, so the incentive to act upon those boundaries significantly reduces. The reason why this is important is that they cannot have the benefit of focusing on all 9 boundaries. The third stakeholder then, on governments. The reason why this is important is because this is independent of people buying in. The first thing I want to point out is that governments lack the incentive to act on their side of the house. One, because governments can never coordinate on one boundary. Opposition parties would just flip-flop between different boundaries that they need to prioritize, which creates gridlock in government, which means that they cannot pass efficient policy. But second, is that they say they focus on the main issue that they see. But the problem is, when you see 4 boundaries that have already been breached, that is when governments can focus on other boundaries that are not important and just point out the fact that they're doing something even if it's not important. But the second thing I want to point out is that governments also lack the capacity to do it because the economic and political capital to care about all 9 boundaries in terms of research is significantly higher. Next question then, in terms of better policies, I want to point out why the clash on buy-in is the most important in this debate. There are 2 reasons for this. 1, this is the prerequisite for better policies. Diversion of resources, creating policy and information is the prerequisite to creating better policies and that can only happen with buy-in. But second, we can co-opt the benefit of all 9 boundaries if we choose carbon as well. And that is why buying into carbon is more important. Carbon has trickle-down effects to other boundaries like ocean acidification, and it also leads to things like acid rains. This is why it takes on their characterization that all other 9 boundaries are also equally important. Carbon is interlinked to all 9 boundaries. The difference then is this between the two sides. On our side, the language that you use to cover the 9 boundaries and the trickle-down effects is that carbon is the most important. On their side, they just point out to the public that all 9 are important. This is why we get better policy on our side. Propose.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting opposition to reply, close out the opposition versus case.
I'm just checking I'm audible. Great. Two sections to this reply speech. First, some analysis on the meta strategy of this debate. Secondly, clash point analysis. Firstly, in terms of the strategy in this debate, there are two strategic flaws that are made on the part of the proposition that means that they are unable to fully engage in this debate in a meaningful manner and thus able to win in terms of clash. The first is a misrepresentation of the counterfactual given to you on opposition and a misrepresentation of status quo. Where in Prop 2, which was the first chance they had to respond, they said that we had to continue pushing for absolutely nothing or vagary, but that was not what we had pushed from the top. In Prop 3, they decided to be a little bit more charitable and say, even if you focus on just this, here's why everything is important. And they continue to say in Prop 3 that status quo is getting nothing done. But this is a misrepresentation of status quo. All the international agreements we've brought to you, all the boundaries we've brought to you, all the progress and new technology we've created exists on our side of the house. But second strategic flaw, a failure to engage in comparative analysis, which is, I am going to concede status quo is not perfect. I am going to concede that status quo is gridlock. There are still two reasons why regardless of that, they still lose. One, they have no analysis as to prove why their side will be better, especially in a world where they have to replace status quo with a new system, and there is a lack of engagement in terms of the clash on buy-in, which is the prerequisite for getting any policy at all. Our strategy on our side was much more simple. We agreed we are not going to solve everything. We are going to have to make some trade-offs. But by solely focusing on carbon dioxide, we are able to do two things. One, we are more likely to do something rather than create government, business, and public apathy. And two, we get solutions to the most pressing issues that are creating the most harm right now. With that clarification on strategy out of the way, the two paths to victory for the opposition in this debate. Firstly, in terms of likelihood of policy, I want to just note the vast lack of response to the content in terms of why we get buy-in and therefore why policy is likely. The fact that on their side, we will focus on all 9 boundaries at once. The only real response we get in P3 is that buzzwords are harder to sell. But this is actually a concession. Buzzwords are important in politics. And if the 9 planetary boundaries is hard to sell, that means you get less policy. 2, the political gridlock that I gave in my first argument, that means that governments trade off environmental policy entirely on their side. 3, the flip that we did as to why you lack a common goal on their side and create fragmentation within the environmental bloc because different people and different groups have different priorities with different boundaries. 4th, public apathy. The fact that people opt out, even if in status quo things are complex, they get exponentially more complex, they get 9-fold more complex, and we flip the Prop 3 claim on extremism in Prop 1 itself, when people don't see the harms of the 9 planetary boundaries and are told they should care about it, that is when they dissociate from the environmental movement. 5th, lobbying. The fact of the matter is this. If it becomes much more difficult for companies to put in any policy at all, they can more easily lobby to not have to put in any policy at all. But lastly, the analysis of why technology will be far more expensive on their side of the house, and therefore why governments are going to trade it off. Comparative is simple. You can't use the nitty-gritty as an excuse, and it is much easier to visualize the harms of people, and people already buy into carbon dioxide. The way here is simple. We are more likely to get some policy. Even if it is not the perfect policy, and even if there is harms to that policy, they get either no policy or some, or at least at the best case, less policy than our side does. Lastly, second clash in terms of the quality of policy. They just have one big push in this clash, which is that the other 9 boundaries are important. We can agree that they're important, but the problem is that CO2 is more urgent. typhoons, major dramatic weather events are caused by CO2. If things like drinking water is a problem, governments have an incentive to fix it on both sides of the house, but it is only on our side where they have to do that and have been pushed to focus on carbon, whereas on their side they fulfill their entire environmental obligation by only doing that. Why is our side better? We prove that focusing all resources on CO2 is the most important. We prove that it is more measurable. We prove that businesses can do more greenwashing and that they actually worsen the environment by allowing for more carbon dioxide emissions. For all of these reasons, opposed.
Thank you for that speech. Inviting proposition reply speaker to give that speech and close out this debate.
How do we make a pool? According to opposition today, you just have to come and pour the water on the sand. And what we do not understand is that how is that going to make that pool? Maybe at one time we are going to be having a lake, a bit of water in the front, but what we will not have it is the pool that we wanted, and what we will not be having is all that water used. Why not? Because we are not adding the other factors that are enabling us to make that pool. So the problem with the opposition today is that, first of all, they had two main structural problems. The first of one is their counter model. Please, oppositions, just tell us what status quo are you talking about? Are you talking about the status quo that we are living in? Because let me tell you something. The status quo that we are living in, we have no quantification of the boundaries. We do not know what exactly that we want from the climate change. What exactly is the point that we want that we are targeting? And in the status quo, we are not only focusing on the climate change as they are advocating. In the status quo, we have the SDGs and we have people advocating for pandas extinction. In the status quo, that is not true, and it's for all that we just think that those 2 points that they, based on all the argumentation, do not, since they do not exist in the status quo, are not valid. But we are going to try and engage with the opposition and try and assume how this, even with the worst case scenario, we are going to be winning this debate. 3 clashes in this debate. First, in which word are individuals going to be acting more? We have presented to you, panel, a broad but inclusive framework. And a framework that we know will work. Why so? Because it is scientifically based, and because as the opposition agreed, it is inclusive. That means that if you want to make a change in the climate problems, you need to actually tackle the other problems. This is something that the opposition talked about. What does that mean? This means that when we are talking about those individuals, we are telling them, okay, care about the climate change, but you know what? You will never achieve anything. You are just going to be pouring water on the sand because you are not engaging with the other problems that are causing this climate change. So because we know that people will not be wanting to engage on something that will never make them satisfied, and because we believe that we have won this debate, and for other reasons. There was also a clash about in which word are the businesses and governments going to be advocating better and more effective. So what we told you is that we are going to be giving those diverse businesses diverse planetary boundaries. Each business is special. Each business cannot contribute directly to the climate change, but we believe that each business can at least do something about those 9 planetary boundaries. This thing that they don't like being the choice is something that we think is useful because each one is going to be able to make that choice. But what they said is only that no, they shouldn't be having that choice. They should just advocate for the climate change, which we believe that not all businesses are going to be able to do that. Then they started talking about this common goal and talking about how if we want to solve other problems, just solve it by themselves. But what we tell you is that if we don't have this common goal within one of the frameworks, one of the boundaries in the framework, for example, as the Indian problem is not going to be able to be solved only by India, we need all the other countries to be within it. And this is why we think it is better in our world, because in their world, this problem is not going to be solved. We only are going to be having the climate change that the whole world maybe is caring about. And it's for all those reasons that we proudly propose this motion.